There are loads, and by that I mean absolutely loads, of quotations that relate to the theme of the supernatural in Charles Dickens' novella, A Christmas Carol. But what do I mean by the theme of the supernatural, and which quotations do I think you need to know most? Let's find out. Hey, how's it going, Revision Squad? It is me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we are going to think about the theme of the supernatural and how it is presented in Charles Dickens' novella, A Christmas Carol. Now to do that, we're going to think about some key contextual information, look over some important quotations, and I'll even provide some ever vital analysis too, which I hope helps you out as you study this text. Now, because we're going to be covering quite a bit in this video, I really do recommend that you grab a pen and some paper like now. That way, as you watch, you will be able to make some notes of the things I say. And if you think that anything that I do say in this video is, I don't know, super helpful, then please do consider giving this video a like, commenting to let me know, subscribing to my channel if you aren't already, and maybe even sharing it with your friends, classmates and teachers too. Your support really does mean an awful lot to me. Alright, so I've said that we're going to be thinking about the theme of the supernatural in this video. But what is meant by supernatural? Well, it's pretty simple really. The prefix super can mean loads of things, but here it roughly means more than. And natural means normal things, you know, things that occur according to the known laws of nature or science. Supernatural then means something that is more than or beyond the natural world. In A Christmas Carol, that immediately makes me think of one thing: all of the various ghosts. It makes me think of the ways in which they appear, the extent of their powers or abilities, and their aims and purposes. However, it doesn't just end with the ghosts. Why not consider anything or anyone else who seems unnatural, strange, or otherworldly? Even the novella's London setting, with its frequent mist and fog, could be considered supernatural to an extent. Right, so before we get stuck into analysing those quotations, it is super important for us to have a quick chat about the Victorians, and the reason for that is because you will be assessed on how you can apply your analysis and discussion of A Christmas Carol to its various contexts. So for the WJEC Educast exam board, this is equal to roughly a third of the marks, and for AQA, I think it's equal to about 20%. And for other exam boards, well, you tell me. I've only taught WJEC Educast and AQA was a lifetime ago. So the Victorians were pretty interested in the supernatural, and I'm sure that is something that you have already talked about in class at some point. But how do we know that the Victorians were interested in the supernatural? Well, it is pretty evident throughout Victorian literature and popular culture. Of course, Dickens wrote a number of ghost stories, but so too did authors such as Edith Nesbit, Elizabeth Gaskett and Rudyard Kipling. This interest in the supernatural also extended to other aspects of Victorian popular culture, with theatre productions and artwork and photography similarly featuring the ghostly much more often. Furthermore, seances became really popular. Now, a seance is an event where a group of people would gather in order to communicate with the dead, usually through a medium or someone who could apparently talk to the dead. Now, so-called scientific developments in the Victorian era also reflect this interest in the supernatural, which is best seen in the development of mesmerism. Now, a mesmerist is somebody who would put a patient, like a medical patient, under a trance, and they would direct the flow of invisible energies through their body in order to make them better, and apparently this worked sometimes. Now Dickens, Charles Dickens, he actually believed himself to be an expert mesmerist. So if that's how we know that the Victorians were interested in the supernatural, why were they so interested in it? Well, there's a number of reasons behind this, I think. One argument is that changes to the publishing industry influenced the interest in the supernatural. Now, during the Victorian era, the periodical form became quite popular. A periodical is a type of smallish, literary publication that is published on a regular basis, hence the name. Magazines, newspapers, and journals are all types of periodical. In this type of publication, you would often find a small section of a story, one that would eventually be told in full over the course of many issues of that periodical. These stories needed to be exciting, neatly segmented, and fairly straightforward, because they're going to be cut up into lots of different slices and you're not going to read all of it in one go necessarily. And you know what? Ghost stories, which were mostly told orally up until this point, fit these conditions perfectly. As such, they were published more and more and more, and more people got to read them, and guess what? Because of that, they became more popular. Another argument is that scientific developments also sparked an interest in the supernatural. The Victorian era was a period of great scientific development, which meant that suddenly ideas that were previously unfathomable or seemingly just out of reach were now normal and accepted and explainable. As such, the Victorians began more and more to entertain ideas and concepts that they couldn't fully explain, just like the supernatural. Sometimes the supernatural was even used to explain something that wasn't explainable. Furthermore, because of all of the scientific developments in the Victorian era, there was a bit of a religious pushback too, by which I mean that faith in the church strengthened in response to the seemingly confusing scientific developments of the time. Now, whilst this did largely mean a resurgence in the Christian faith, a number of minor or less mainstream faiths also emerged. Furthermore, the Catholic Church proclaims that ghosts were disturbed spirits who were trapped in purgatory and unable to rest because of the sins that they had committed in life. Specific scientific developments might also explain why the Victorians were so interested in the supernatural. Emily Vincent, one of my best friends, fellow English Literature PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and expert in all things Victorian and ghostly, explained in a recent interview with The Independent how belief in the supernatural is an amplification of the strange and often unnerving experiences of the everyday. The Victorian era saw the invention of the telegram and telephone, and suddenly individuals were able to communicate across long distances with otherwise absent people. Seance technologies, such as the planchette or Ouija boards, reflected this too. After all, they supposedly enabled you to communicate with somebody who was absent. Just, in this case, they're dead. Now, the rising popularity of gas lamps in the Victorian era might also explain why people were so interested in the supernatural at the time Dickens was writing. Gas lamps emit potentially deadly carbon monoxide, which, in small doses, can cause hallucinations. As gas lamps became more and more popular and were used inside people's homes or in public gathering spaces, the number of people who had hallucinations and apparently saw otherworldly apparitions rose. Now, economic changes can also account for the fascination with the supernatural. Now, this is a piece of context that I think is absolutely fascinating, and it's something I've only learned as I've done research for this video. Here's the thing. The Victorian era, as I'm sure you know, coincided with the Industrial Revolution. Now, you're probably sat there thinking, yeah, I know, the Industrial Revolution, loads of people worked in factories, great, don't see how this is relevant to the theme of the supernatural at all. And you know what? Fair enough. But the reason why you probably think that is because you don't know that the influx of country folk didn't just extend to factories. Many people came from the countryside to the city and became servants to much, much richer city folk, and many gained employment during the dark and cold autumn and winter months. For the servants, this meant working in a large, dark and mysterious house, the perfect setting for a ghost story or two. Furthermore, servants were often expected to be seen, but not heard, and were able to apparently pop up from nowhere in the houses in which they worked, thanks to hidden servant entrances and servant corridors. For their masters and mistresses then, their servants may as well have been ghosts. Finally, it is worth us acknowledging that there was an awful lot of death in the Victorian times. As such, Victorians were probably going to be thinking quite a bit about the deceased, about the afterlife, about spirits. Right, I appreciate that was a lot of information to take in, so well done for listening so patiently, and if you're taking notes, I imagine they're amazing. As I said only earlier on in the video, it is so important to have a firm understanding of context, so I hope that all of that was useful. Now, let's have a think about some specific quotations to do with the supernatural. Yeah? Alright, if you've watched any of my other videos in this series, you know what I'm going to say here. All the page references that will appear on screen over the course of this video relate to this copy of the book. Now, of course, our page numbers will likely differ if we're using different editions of the story, but I hope I still make the quotations easy enough to locate. Our first quotation is actually super easy to find, I promise you, because it is the very first sentence of the entire story, which is, Marley was dead to begin with. Okay, so what can we say about this quotation, particularly with the theme of the supernatural in mind? Well, I would say that it foregrounds the importance of the supernatural. The reason why I say this is that although the first half of the sentence establishes the death of a character, even the focus on death itself makes it sort of related to the theme of the supernatural, the phrase in the second half, to begin with, makes it pretty apparent that this deathliness is going to be overturned in some way, which definitely has supernatural overtones. Furthermore, this sentence foregrounds the importance of the supernatural to the story because of its prominent position. It's the first sentence. Dickens clearly wants to make it clear to the reader before they've even got properly started that his tale will relate to the supernatural in some way. Given the genre's popularity at the time, this will have firmly hooked many readers, which would have allowed Dickens to spread his socially conscious message much more successfully. Our next quotation, which also comes from Stave 1, occurs when Scrooge goes home. Before opening the door, Dickens writes, Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any immediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Now, how does this relate to the supernatural? Well, it is, of course, the first significant supernatural occurrence in the story, I think. Having your door knocker apparently transform into your dead business partner's face, well, that's hardly normal, is it? The fact that it is Marley's face also links back to the story's first sentence too, and so what was previously a hint at the supernatural now becomes something much more explicit. However, the lack of a noticeable transformation, as seen by without its undergoing any immediate process of change, indicates that the supernatural transcends, so it goes above and beyond, human comprehension. Perhaps this relates to the Victorian anxiety about how the world, or what they knew about the world and how they knew these things about it, were seemingly changing all the time, or how they became aware of just how much they didn't know, thanks to the rapid scientific development of the time. Quotation number 3, also from Stave 1, relates to the presentation of Jacob Marley's ghost. Once Scrooge has actually seen the ghost, it is revealed in the narration that there was something very awful too in the spectres being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Now, this, I argue, presents the supernatural as something to fear, given the use of the adjective awful, which is emphasised by the intensifier very. In particular, it is the spirit's infernal atmosphere, the fact that it looks like it comes from hell. That is terrifying. Now, this idea of hell does indeed relate to contemporary religious beliefs. As much as the Catholics taught that ghosts were disturbed spirits whose souls were trapped in purgatory because of the sins that they had committed in life, it was also generally believed that sinners, which Marley clearly is, went to hell. Here then, it could be argued that Marley's supernatural appearance warns of the dangers of leading a selfish, money-obsessed lifestyle. Still in stave 1, Marley's ghost tells Scrooge, "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread." I think we could say that this quotation presents the supernatural as being something moralistic, didactic, or heuristic. Basically, those are super fancy ways of saying that because Marley tells Scrooge that the Christmas ghosts will enable the miser to shun the path that Marley took, we get the impression that the ghosts are trying to teach Scrooge a lesson. Furthermore, not only are the Christmas ghosts going to literally teach Scrooge a lesson, but Marley's ghost is also teaching him one too, by providing Scrooge with a clear example of the exact fate that he should seek to avoid. Now this, I reckon, links to seances and mediums and all that lovely stuff, because it ties into the popular belief that the supernatural would attempt to pass on messages to the living. The only difference here is that the supernatural is directly communicating to the living and does not need a messenger of any kind. Right, so that's stave 1 over. Let's quickly turn our attention to stave 2. Early on in this part of the story, Scrooge encounters the ghost of Christmas past, which is described as being a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man. Now, I think that this description of the spirit presents the supernatural as being something strange and confusing and beyond human understanding. The reason why I say this is that the description of the spirit, which in fact goes on for like almost a page, and so you could pick out plenty of other details if you don't fancy the ones on screen now, this description is full of contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. Nothing about the spirit's appearance, it seems, makes much sense. This unfathomability relates to the Victorian understanding of the world. The stability of the pre-Victorian, largely religious understanding of the world was gone, thanks to the scientific developments of the time. And so the world suddenly became a much more confusing, unknowable place. We're actually going to jump straight to stave 3 now, in which Scrooge meets another spirit, this time the ghost of Christmas present. Before Scrooge properly meets the spirit, it utters the following dialogue. "Come in!" exclaims the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man!" Now I reckon this presents a positive and almost welcoming aspect to the supernatural. I think it is really important for us to recognise that the supernatural during the Victorian times was not necessarily something that was just a source of fear. In fact, a belief in the supernatural presented Victorians with a great source of comfort. It helped them to make sense of a world that was growing increasingly confusing because if something was completely unexplainable, they could just say that spirits caused it. And furthermore, seances and other forms of communication would have provided Victorians with a sense of comfort because they would have enabled them to apparently communicate with the dead and speak with their lost loved ones. The reason why I think that this quotation presents a positive and welcoming aspect to the supernatural is because the ghost's repetition of "Come in!" is quite friendly and welcoming, as is its invitation for Scrooge to know it better, because this shows that it is encouraging a warm and positive relationship between the two of them. At the end of Stave 3, the Ghost of Christmas Present reveals to Scrooge two supernatural entities, which we learn go by the names Ignorance and Want. Now, quite a bit is said about them over a small handful of pages, but the quotation that I would like to focus on is, "Where angels might have sat, devils lurked, and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread." Now, I think that this quotation shows how the unnaturalness of the supernatural can in fact be horrifying or disturbing, given that Ignorance and Want look at Scrooge menacingly, and that they are horrible and dread monsters. But here's the thing. I think Dickens is making less of a comment about the supernatural here, and more of a comment about humanity. Ignorance and Want might be horrifying, but it is the things that they represent, the effects of social inequality, that are truly horrifying and unnatural here. Interestingly, it seems that Dickens is choosing to use something that has no proof of existing that people like to talk about, the supernatural, to make a comment about something that clearly exists in his time that people choose to not talk about. That being, of course, the rampant social inequality that plagued the lives of so many. This is a key idea, I think. As much as ghosts and spirits appear throughout A Christmas Carol, the story isn't really about them. Dickens just uses the supernatural as a way of talking about societal issues, because he knows that this would have been an effective way of encouraging a conversation among his readers about those issues. Many of the spirits are just a vehicle for Dickens's plot. And you know what? Dickens's plot is just a vehicle for his message. The final quotation that I would like to cover, in detail at least in this video, is one that focuses on the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. You know, the last spirit that Scrooge meets. Quite early on in Stave 4, the narration reveals that, in response to something Scrooge says, "The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand." Now, all I really want to say in relation to this quotation is that it presents the supernatural as, ultimately, uncontrollable and actually quite mysterious. Because the spirit answers not, Dickens reminds his readers that the supernatural is much more powerful than people are, and by writing that it pointed onward with its hand, he presents the supernatural as mysterious because it does not communicate in a straightforward way. The mystery around supernatural communication and the depiction of a silent spectre could relate to how the supernatural was thought to communicate in the Victorian times. Ghosts, as we said before, never spoke directly to people. They would have to communicate through a medium or via the planchette or a Ouija board. And even then, their messages were often quite vague and mysterious, never quite giving out clear answers, but apparently saying things that were very much open to interpretation. In having a silent spirit, perhaps Dickens is trying to recreate this air of mystery. Okay then, so that is my quotation analysis complete, but don't close the video just yet. There is loads of useful stuff to come. For instance, a summary. If we wanted to summarise how Dickens has made use of the theme of the supernatural in his story, what could we say? Well, we could say that drawing on the popularity of the supernatural in the Victorian era, Dickens presents the supernatural as didactic, incomprehensible and powerful so that he could convey his message about the necessity of creating a fairer society. Now, this summary achieves a number of things. First of all, it starts to get into some context, the idea that the supernatural was popular in the Victorian era. Secondly, it has three key words: didactic, incomprehensible and powerful, each of which could prompt an analytical paragraph. And finally, it talks about Dickens's purpose and the fact that he has ultimately used the supernatural as a vehicle for conveying a much bigger message. Remember what I said just earlier when I discussed ignorance and want. As much as the supernatural appears throughout this story isn't really about the supernatural. It's just a vehicle for Dickens's moral message. Now, if you think that that summary is going to be useful for you to write down, now's your time to pause the video and do so, because we're about to move forwards and think about the next steps that you could take. So what are those next steps then? Well, first of all, if you wanted to, you could produce a 5-point essay plan that covers the presentation of the supernatural in the story. It's all well and good having loads of ideas, but you also need to practice shaping them into an argument. So drawing up essay plans is always a useful task to give a go. Now, as you can see, I've given a hint there that you could write a paragraph for each main supernatural entity encountered in the story. Those being the 3 main Christmas ghosts, Jacob Marley, and ignorance and want. But that doesn't mean that that is the only option you have. Why not give it a go, bullet points even, and share it down in the comments section. I love seeing your ideas and always respond to them too, which means I'll give you some feedback. Just remember though, if you're going to do an essay plan, to outline the key point, quotations, a summary of those quotations analyses, and use of context for each paragraph. You need to make sure that you fit in all of those aspects into your essay after all. Or if you don't fancy doing that essay plan and you're instead after some further ideas that I haven't quite covered in this video, why not go back through your copy of the text and think about the description of the setting, especially the references to fog and mist that are littered throughout the story. How might the description add to the story's supernatural air? Or why not consider how, in the middle 3 staves, Scrooge is essentially a silent, invisible visitor? How might that relate to some of the context that we have discussed in this video? Or what about the various supernatural powers that are demonstrated, mostly by the spirits, in this story? Flight, teleportation, and seeing into the future are all included. Or finally, what about the narrator? Aren't they also some sort of disembodied voice? Could the narrator in some ways also be considered a supernatural entity? And finally, if you don't like either of those things, you could also watch my videos about all of the supernatural characters mentioned in this video in order to get a fuller understanding of each of them. Those videos have loads and loads and loads of quotations for each of those characters, and I discuss them in quite some depth, meaning that if you watch those videos as well as this one, you should have an amazing understanding of the supernatural. Furthermore, you could have a read through of my bibliography, which is just a fancy way of saying the list of texts that I have read in order to make this video. Now, my bibliography contains plenty of useful additional contextual information that's going to help you out loads with your studies, and it also includes a link to the interview with my friend Emily. Remember though, and this is really important to remember whilst you're doing this research, A Christmas Carol was published in 1843. And so things in the Victorian times that happened way after that date, they're not going to be super relevant. Blimey, whew, that was a lot. But you'll be glad to know that that is my discussion of the theme of the supernatural in Charles Dickens' novella A Christmas Carol complete. I genuinely hope that this video has been helpful in some way, either because you are revising for your exams, are studying this text for the first time, or you're just otherwise reading Dickens' Christmas tale for fun. Now, if this video has been helpful at all, please do consider giving it a like, writing me a comment to let me know, subscribing if you aren't already, and of course sharing it with anyone who might find it useful as well. All of those things really do help me out loads, and so of course I massively appreciate it. Anyway, as ever, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day, and if you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be.
So there you go. If you want to talk about the theme of the supernatural in A Christmas Carol, you can of course talk about all of the ghostly visitors that Scrooge encounters along his journey. Not just the three Christmas spirits, but also Jacob Marley and Ignorance and Want too. But think about not just the character of those spirits, but also their powers and abilities too. Or also, if you really want those top grades, how Scrooge might be considered a spirit himself.